Good morning. This is 7th grade social studies and I'm Dina Vandenbosch. Let's learn some geography. This week we're going to be continuing with our standards, geography priority standard, and this week we're going to be looking at 10.1, which is identifying the natural hazards that impact this region. So we're going to see lots of ways that this is going to be impacted this week. But before we do that, let's play our Where in the World game. Where in the World is where we try to guess the correct location with as few clues as possible. So clue number 1, it's in the Eastern Hemisphere. All right. Clue number 2, it's at 38 degrees north latitude. Now for some of you who remember that lines of latitude also go by the name of parallels, you have probably already guessed this. But let's keep going. Clue number 3. A war was fought here between 1950 and 1953. And if you haven't guessed it yet, let's go to clue number 4. This is the most heavily patrolled and guarded border in the world. Did you guess what it was? If you guessed the Demilitarized Zone, or otherwise known as the DMZ, you're absolutely correct. This is the border of North and South Korea. It's basically the boundary that was in place at the end of the Korean War in 1953. It's about 2.5 miles wide. They created a buffer zone about 1.5 miles on each side of the border. It goes for about 160 miles across the peninsula of Korea. And there is a joint security area known as Panmunjom, which is the site of diplomatic meetings in the DMZ. So, does that tell you what region we're going to today? It should. We're going to be going to East Asia. But I bet some of you thought I was going to do the Great Wall of China as this week's mystery location, and you were almost right. So today's objective is to examine the physical geography of this region, East Asia. And what we're going to specifically look at is all these natural hazards that they experience in this region and the impacts that they have. So let's start here in the United States and go across the world to Beijing, China. It's about 6,900 miles from our own capital in Washington, D.C., and we're going to be looking at China and its neighbors. But wait a minute, I bet you already have a viewer question. I can already hear it. The question is, Ms. Vandenbosch, what was going on with that map? And I get this question a lot. Let's take a look at that map. What's different about it? You're probably not used to seeing it look this way, are you? Okay, you're used to thinking about going the other way to Europe and Africa and Asia. Well, we can travel west too. This map here with the Pacific Ocean in the middle is called a Pacific-centric map. Okay, centric means focused. So we can show the world this way too, why not? But we often see it the other way, don't we? So we're looking at East Asia, and so let's look at the countries that make up East Asia. So obviously China here in the yellow is the largest country in this region. China is actually the 4th largest country in the world behind Russia, the United States, or Russia, Canada, and the United States. To the north of China is Mongolia. Then on the peninsula in the purple and pink there we have North Korea and South Korea. And then to their east is the island country of Japan. And then the small island off the southeastern coast of China is Taiwan. Now you've noticed I put an asterisk by Taiwan, so you know there's a story there. Taiwan is the province that the nationalist government went to in 1949 when the Communist Revolution took over China. They believed themselves to be the legitimate government of China. The mainland has a different idea. So it is not recognized by the United Nations as its own country. China regards it as one of its provinces, and the United States also takes on the policy that there's one China and Taiwan is part of that. Let's look at our capitals. The capital of China is Beijing. The capital of Mongolia is Ulaanbaatar. The capital of North Korea is Pyongyang. Capital of South Korea is Seoul. Of Japan is Tokyo. And then of Taiwan is Taipei. So that's our political map of East Asia. Let's look at our physical map. First, let's look at the bodies of water. First of all, of course, we've got the Pacific Ocean to the east. And then between the Korean Peninsula and Japan, we've got the Sea of Japan, also known as the East Sea. Between the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese mainland, we've got the Yellow Sea. Off to the east is the East China Sea. To the southeast is the South China Sea. We also have some significant rivers in China. One of those is the Huanghe, also known as the Yellow River. It gets its name from the yellow silt soil that colors the waters there. And also to the south is the Chengjiang, or otherwise known as the Yangtze River. These are both very important rivers to China, and they both have their start in the highlands in the southwest. Let's continue with the physical map. Let's look at our elevation. And you should notice, first off, those dark oranges in the southwest. We know from last week when we looked at South Asia that we've got the Himalayan mountains down there. So we know that those are the highest elevations on Earth. But just looking at this map, you can really see that most of East Asia has some very high elevations, save for the coast. Okay, we'll talk about that. We've got the Korean Peninsula. It's got some low-lying elevations, but it's rather mountainous and hilly, as well as Japan. Japan is known as an archipelago. You should remember that term. It means it's a chain or a series of islands. There are 4 main islands in Japan. Going from north to south, we've got Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. And then let's do major landforms. As I mentioned, we've got the Himalayan mountains that are on the border region between Nepal and India and China. We've got the Kunlun mountain range, which is another significant mountain range in this area. The Tian Shan mountains. The Atlay mountains between China and Mongolia. We also have the plateau of Tibet. Remember, a landform known as a plateau is area of high elevation that's rather flat, but it's still at a very high elevation. We also have the Taklamakan Desert. You may not think of deserts when you think of China, but they have 2, the Taklamakan to the west and then the Gobi Desert, which is part of Mongolia and China. And then we have to talk about the North China Plain, and that's the low-lying areas around the coast. So I want you to make a prediction. Knowing what you know about the physical geography of China, can you guess where most of the people live? And if you've been with me all this time, you know, and you should probably think of yourself as a human, where would you like to live? Knowing the physical geography, let's make a prediction about their population density. Where do you think it would be on this map? And if you're looking at the green, thinking, I think I'd like to live where the land is fertile, it's got rivers that would provide irrigation and drinking water, you are absolutely correct. Look at that. You can really see how most of the population in East Asia is clustered around those low-lying coastal areas along the eastern coast of China. You can see how heavily populated it is. One dot represents 100,000 people. So this is among the densest population on Earth. So, were you right? Of course you were. All right. And also, we can compare that to where the location of the Chinese rivers are. This graphic shows a map of China with its rivers, and also the circles represent cities. And so the larger the city is, the larger the circle is going to be on this. So you can really see a correlation between the location of rivers and the locations of settlements, cities. And that is no coincidence. Speaking of population density, I've zoomed in to the Korean Peninsula. So what you're seeing here is North and South Korea. I want you to consider how populated that looks, but then let's look at a satellite image at night. Okay, I want you to think about what this means and what accounts for this. Okay, so at night we can really see the locations of cities in South Korea. In fact, the capital city of Seoul just lights up. But if you look at North Korea, it's almost a blank slate, except for this one dot, and that's the location of their capital, Pyongyang. Okay? So we have to be careful in our interpretations. If you just saw this, you may assume they don't have much population in North Korea. But looking at our population density map would tell a different story. So this is accounted for by other explanations, and that is, you know, the North Korean government is a communist government. Their economy is not nearly as strong as South Korea. Their energy use is a very different story. So let's do East Asia by the numbers, and we've got our countries of East Asia in alphabetical order, along with their land area and their population. We also throw in the United States as a reference. So my first question to you is, how does China's land area and population compare to the United States? So if we look at China, the land area is 3 million or more square miles. Its population is 1.3 billion according to this data, and it's probably at least 6 years old. And then the United States, its land area is a little over, or 3.5 million square miles. So how does that compare to China's? Very similar, right? They have about the same land area. So what's the big story here? The big difference is their population. With the same land area, look at the difference in population. China at 1.3 billion, the United States, according to this, at 307 million people. Okay, so China's got 4 times as many people in about the same land area. Let's look at a different country, Mongolia. You don't hear much about Mongolia, so let's give it some attention. What can you conclude about Mongolia? Well, let's look at its land area. The land area is 600,000, and comparing that to the other countries in East Asia, it's actually the second largest country in East Asia. But then look at its population. What can you conclude? Not many people live in Mongolia, okay? For it to be the size it is, its population is tiny compared to its neighbors. Okay, so let's figure out why. Here's a view of the Gobi Desert, which I've mentioned makes up a lot of Mongolia. Most of the desert there is bare rock rather than sand. They get very little rainfall throughout the year. A lot of people there are nomadic herders. And there's some beautiful rock formations that you can see there. Some other sparsely populated areas in China is the Tibetan Plateau, or the Plateau of Tibet. The average elevation there is 13,000 feet. It's the world's highest plateau, sometimes called the rooftop of the world. It's just above the Himalaya mountain range. A very arid and dry climate, so not much is done there except for grazing of animals. But they do have lakes there that are basically the headwaters for those major rivers that we talked about a bit ago. So let's do some East Asia quick facts. I wish we could do more on East Asia because it's a fascinating region. But first of all, China, as we mentioned, is the most populated country in the world. It's about 1.3 billion people. However, if you'll remember from last week, we talked about India is fast approaching China's population and will probably surpass it in the next decade. Tokyo, Japan is the world's most populated city. It's about 38 million people there on the island of Honshu. Japan itself is about 80% mountainous, volcanic terrain, so most of the people are very much clustered together in close quarters on the plains of Japan. Some of the world's top economies are in East Asia. China has the world's second largest economy behind the United States. Japan, a very strong top 5 economy. South Korea in the top 12, depending on what list you look at. A lot of exports to the rest of the world. A lot of manufacturing happens in these countries. Electronics and cars in Japan and South Korea are exported around the world. Also, you'll learn next year in world history about China's, what is the world's longest continuous civilizations. In China and the surrounding neighbors, they have numerous cultural contributions that we still use today, numerous inventions, anything from silk to porcelain to the magnetic compass, gunpowder, fireworks, you name it. Paper was invented here. Some really cool contributions to the world, and also continuing to contribute. As some of my students like some of the pop culture contributions that come out of Japan. Here's anime. Some of my students love the Korean pop music, the K-pop that comes from there. So this area of the world is rich in culture and it definitely has an impact on the rest of the world. But instead of culture today, we're going to focus more on the physical environment, the natural hazards. So let's look at some of those natural hazards that impact East Asia. Okay, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, very much part of the story in this area, especially on Japan. It averages about 1,500 seismic occurrences a year. Can you imagine that? Now, many of them may not be that strong, but they also have river flooding caused by monsoon rains. This is a big part of China's story throughout the centuries. Mudslides and landslides, the way they use their land and manage their erosion, this can be very devastating and has caused deaths of millions of people throughout the centuries. And also coastal tsunamis. This can be related to the earthquakes that we mentioned. The tidal waves that come off of those earthquakes, and tropical typhoons. They average about 5 per year. These are all natural hazards that are very much part of life in East Asia. You've probably heard about the Ring of Fire. This is a zone surrounding the Pacific Ocean where tectonic plates meet, and this is going to be where you have a lot of heightened seismic activity. All right, so let's see if that's true. I pulled up a MapMaker Interactive of locations of significant volcano eruptions over the years. And where you see a triangle, that's been a significant volcanic eruption. And the darker the triangle and the larger the triangle, the more significant it was. Okay, let's look and see how that compares to the location of earthquake activities. And these are just earthquakes since 1900. Do you see a correlation? Okay, you can really see how those volcanic eruptions and earthquakes are located in the same region. And that's why we conclude that that's the Ring of Fire, okay, around the Pacific Ocean. And don't forget the United States, the coast of the United States and the coast of South America and Central America also form that Ring of Fire. Mount Fuji is one of our more well-known mountains and volcanoes in this region. It's the tallest mountain in Japan. It's on the island of Honshu. It's about 60 miles from Tokyo, on a clear day they can see it from Tokyo. It hasn't erupted since about the 1700s, but this mountain is a beautiful mountain and it's seen as a national symbol of the Japanese people. There are some other active mountains, active volcanoes in Japan, the Asahi Daki, which is on the island of Kyoto. It's an active volcano, and it's interesting because people still hike on it, people still ski and snowboard on it, even as steam is coming up through it. So they're a little bit more adventurous than I am. And also Mount Azo, which is on the island of Kyushu, is the largest active volcano in Japan. Another visual vocabulary word, tsunami. Okay, so tsunami, the T is obviously silent. This is a giant ocean wave that is has a lot of tremendous power, and it's triggered by an underwater earthquake. And a lot of my students will ask me, well, can't you just swim away from a tsunami? No, it's going to be so powerful that it's going to knock down buildings. It's going to have so much debris and cars and structures that it would really be hard to survive that if you are caught in a tsunami. In fact, on March 21st, 2011, Japan experienced a significant tsunami. On this day, there was an earthquake, a 9.0 earthquake that hit this region and triggered a 23-foot tsunami. So they had earthquake damage, they had tsunami damage, and then what's more, they also had damage at a nuclear power plant, Fukushima. And so they had the perfect storm of hazards that day, and they're still recovering to this day from what happened then. Typhoons is another type of hazard that they experience in East Asia. We know what a typhoon is. It's what a hurricane is to us. It's a tropical storm that brings heavy winds and heavy rain. It can cause significant destruction and flooding. And the season for typhoons is typically between May and September in East Asia. But even if it's not a tropical storm, China has also had to deal with its own flooding from its rivers. Here you have a view of the Changyang River, which is also called the Yangtze River. It's the longest in Asia and the third longest in China. But one of the problems they have is with the flooding that has happened in this river. For centuries, it is caused by heavy rain, the rainy seasons, the monsoon seasons, and it's very hard to control. And unfortunately, it's been responsible for untold destruction. And millions of people have died from river flooding in China. So one of the things that the Chinese government has done is build the Three Gorges Dam. The word gorge means a deep, narrow passage. It is on this river, and it's the world's largest hydroelectric plant. So they've constructed this to control the flooding and also to generate power. It's about 1.3 miles wide. That was the narrowest section of this river, and about 600 feet high. But this project has not been without its drawbacks. So there are some benefits to it as well as some drawbacks. The benefits is that it controls the flooding. It provides hydroelectric power. It has spurred economic activity in this region. It's allowed ships to basically travel this river in ways they couldn't do before. But the drawbacks have been significant. To be able to create that reservoir of water, they had to purposefully flood thousands of villages and towns. They displaced millions of people that had to go elsewhere. There's concern about environmental damage and pollution, polluted sites that are now underwater, historic and cultural sites that are now underwater. So this Three Gorges Dam is an example of something that's brought benefits and drawbacks. So let's also look at human-environmental interaction, how humans have impacted their world here. And impacts of poor land management. If you have poor land use and that leads to soil erosion and drought, then dust storms and desertification are also part of the mix. It can lead to flooding, landslides, mudslides, and other things that destroy property, destroy crops, bring loss of life that could be somewhat mitigated if people did different things with the land. Here's a chart that shows you the major Japanese earthquakes since 1900. They're organized by date. They've chosen about 8 or 9 here of the most significant, starting with the most recent in March 11, 2011. I want to, and I just kind of explained how it's arranged, but which earthquake had the highest magnitude? So looking at this, and we're looking at the middle column there, which one do you see is the highest magnitude? And you should notice that the 9.0 in 2011 was the highest, and the death toll, according to this, is 28,000. I want you to compare that to 1923, which is at the very bottom. There was a earthquake in Kanto with the 7.9, but look at the death toll, 142,000. So what can you conclude about that? Is magnitude of an earthquake always the best predictor of the death toll? There may be other factors, right? The factors could be how close proximity it was to a populated area, how deep within the earth the earthquake actually was. Unfortunately, there is a correlation between population patterns and the natural hazards in this region. Unfortunately, the people of East Asia live in those areas that are prone to the natural hazards, the low-lying areas, the coastal areas that are prone to these. So let's wrap it up with our essential question. What are the impacts of natural hazards in East Asia? Well, its location along the Ring of Fire make earthquakes, volcanic activity, and tsunamis a constant threat to life and property here. They deal with flooding, they deal with typhoons, and all of this can be destructive in this region. And unfortunately, the densely populated coastal areas of these regions are particularly vulnerable. So just a few wrap-up questions. Japan's physical geography can be classified as which of the following landforms? It is an isthmus, peninsula, archipelago, mainland, or delta. And you guessed it, it's an archipelago. Remember, a chain of islands. If you forgot what isthmus was, an isthmus is that narrow piece of land, think about Central America and the Isthmus of Panama. Next question. Since Japan, North Korea, and South Korea are mainly mountainous, where do most people choose to live? And your answer choices are coastal plains, remote areas, land at high elevations, or far from the coast. And you guessed it, coastal plains. And then lastly, which of these areas in East Asia has the highest population density? And even if you haven't been listening today, I bet you can figure this out. Gobi Desert, Kunlun Mountains, Plateau of Tibet, North China Plain, or the Taklamakan Desert. And you guessed it, it's the North China Plain. Low-lying areas, typically around river valleys, where life is hospitable, unlike some of these other places. So, we've talked about East Asia today and the natural hazards that are part of this area. Next week, join us. We'll be back, and we're going to be talking about Southeast Asia and any other region of the world that we haven't finished this year. And we look forward to having you with us next week. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great week.